Hello. So today we're going to talk about World War II, and the discussion about World War II is not necessarily going to be very France specific at this point. We will talk more about the role of France later on in the next module, but in this module, we're just going to talk about the significance of World War II and a little bit about France's um, presence or reaction to World War II. So, really, the first question that everyone has is how did Europe end up in World War II? It was such an unimaginable war. And for me, it hits a little close to home because my parents and my grandparents were alive during World War II. So they had memories of World War II that they would share with me, and I'll share at least one of those memories with you, or some of those memories with you. So the big question is how can a nation just become so entrenched into one person and believe in that one person? So the first thing I want to mention is that we are coming off of World War One, which ended in 1918. And part of the deal with World War One is that Germany is to repay the rest of Europe for the damages caused by the war. So they have this tremendous financial burden, tremendous stress, while the whole of Europe is rebuilding from World War One, and the Germans are at fault. Um, Europe is asking a lot of Germany. So this kind of creates this environment of Germans against the rest of them. So there wasn't just Germany in World War II. Um, so let's take a look at this world map. And here you can see that there were other areas that had issues. So Benito Mussolini was the ruler of Italy, and he kind of took his cues from Hitler, and he felt, well, I should back up a little bit. Hitler's main goal in this whole endeavor was to reunite the people with Germanic descent, so to create a pure Germanic race. So Benito Mussolini felt that he somehow, even though Ethiopia is not necessarily Italian, but he just felt that it was okay for him to colonize Italy following Hitler's lead. So it should be noted that that Ethiopia was a country with very little military defenses. They just did not were not able to mount any kind of defense against the Italians. So the Italians kind of attacked a sitting duck. And one of the issues was that Europe did not come to the aid of Ethiopia. It imposed sanctions on Italy, but that was not really enough for Italy to be discouraged from continuing its invasion on Ethiopia, which was basically defenseless. So we have on one side we have Hitler deciding that he's going to start invading countries. He decides that, these agreements that we had with the other countries of Europe, well, why should I follow them? They don't benefit the Germans. So he just kind of rescinds all these agreements of non-aggression versus other countries. And although Hitler rescinds the agreements, the other countries do not rescind the agreements. So just imagine if, let's say, Canada, the United States, and Mexico were in an agreement of non-aggression, and one of the three decides to rescind the agreement and kind of, opens up the door towards aggression, what do the other two do? So, as you can imagine, bureaucracy takes over, and I'm sure politics and a lot of talking. But in the meantime, the country that has rescinded, they've decided that they've rescinded and they don't really care anymore. So this was kind of the situation that Germany was in, and the rest of Europe, was that Hitler, having been elected, he decided to rescind his non-aggression agreements with Europe. But that left the rest of Europe, which is, let's say 10 countries at least, to decide what they were going to do. So, given that time frame, he had time to do what he wanted to do. But anyways, so we have Ethiopia involved with Italy, and Italy moving in on Ethiopia. And then on the other side of the world, we also have Japan, where there's somewhat of an oligarchy, a small group controlling the government, and they decide to invade China, or to attack China and start a war without much warning. So the Japanese are involved in a war with the Chinese. The Italians are involved in a war with the Ethiopians. And Hitler is moving in on countries where he believes Germanic descent should be brought to the forefront. So a messy situation, to say the least. But this gives you an idea of why this is called a world war, and also kind of the context in which this world war happened, because, like I said before, Germany was blamed for World War I and was held to reparations, which meant that the German people were suffering and were poor, and the money that they earned had to go to the rest of Europe. And when you're disenfranchised and when things are blamed on you, you try to find somebody else to blame things on. So this is kind of what happened with World War II. So here we have the three big players to the start of World War II. Hitler, which you obviously know, who was I guess a failed artist, if you want to call him that. I'm not sure, I haven't seen his art, but he wasn't accepted to art school, which really frustrated him. And so he became kind of a military man and a politician. You have Benito Mussolini there on the lower right, the leader, the dictator of Italy. And you have Hirohito on the top right. And so that was more of an oligarchic situation in Japan, where a certain group of people were kind of making all the decisions. Okay, so we have this trio around the world who are just kind of stirring things up, but the question still remains, how did so many accept Hitler? So, like I said, we have Japan, Italy, and Germany. Japan attacks China. Italy attacks Ethiopia, which has no way of defending itself. And Germany starts rescinding its previous agreements. And Hitler's goal was to form some kind of collective of people who had Germanic descent. So we're mostly going to focus, obviously, on what Hitler did, since this is what mostly affects France. And one thing I want to do is kind of think about, how did he convince the Germans to get on board with this plan? And I should mention, first of all, the Germans had no idea of the actual plan. The extermination of the Jews was not something that the Germans were aware of. this was a very gradual thing. So here we go. Let's talk about this a little bit. So the first thing on Hitler's to-do list was to get rid of or control the press. And let's not forget that at this point in time, the press was the only way people knew about what was going on elsewhere. You had very limited contact with the outside world, outside of your village or whatever. So the way that you would find out about what was going on around the world was through the newspaper that you could buy, or maybe the radio show that you would listen to. But there was no widespread television, no internet, no finding out what people around the world thought at the drop of a hat. So whatever was in the newspaper, whatever was being said on the radio, those were the things that you heard. And, the gossip around your town. So those were typically the sources of information that people would get. So if you got rid of the press or you controlled the press, this would give you a big leg up. And of course, you do this gradually. You don't put out massive statements. You kind of just start insinuating things and bringing people to your side, and which is what Hitler did very effectively. The second thing he did was he increased the propaganda. So the way he increased the propaganda was that he took control of sort of cultural outlets. So movies, music, theater. So movies would become about Hitler. And one movie that I actually really like to watch is *Inglourious Basterds*. I feel like it's an actual very accurate representation of World War II, where, films are being made about the greatness of the movement. And you can even see such things in more recent time when you talk about North Korea. They also have made films, kind of propaganda films about promoting their own system of government and how the West is bad. So Hitler did the same types of things, and music was the same thing. There were songs about how wonderful the Aryan race was and how terrible the Jews were. So these cultural outlets influence people into kind of veering them in a certain direction without even completely being aware of it. They also set up youth programs where kind of like the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts, but at the same time feeding Nazi propaganda to them. So these were very effective means of increasing the number of Germans who would join the Nazi movement, and also feeling a sense of patriotism towards this movement. The next step is to take officials who are in office and replace them, key officials, and replace them with people who are friendly to your cause. So this is what Hitler did. He started replacing people in certain positions with people who were more inclined to see things his way. So you start replacing those people, you start getting legislation passed, you start kind of changing laws and being able to force people to do things or force people not to do things. And the next step is, which is now you start becoming more covert about your actions. You can create a secret police, which is what he did. He created a secret police called, it was basically the KGB, and these people were sent to silence those who dissented against the movement. So they would silence intellectuals, they would silence artists. anyone who did not see what should have been seen according to Hitler could have been silenced very easily. And this did happen frequently. This wasn't just a random occurrence. And then the last step there is, as you've built your propaganda machine against a certain population, you send them to forced labor, and you say that it's either for national safety, or that it's for their own good, or that it's necessary. So this is the last thing that Hitler did, was to force certain populations into forced labor and disguise it as something that wasn't necessarily violent or bad, but was seen as, well, this is, you know what, this is how you're going to repay Germany. This is how, you know what, you've had your share and you're doing quite well, and we can all see that you're doing well. And so now it's time for you to kind of help us out and pay Germany back, because one of the parts of the propaganda was to kind of portray the Jewish population as taking advantage of the German people and getting rich off the backs of Germans. So this was somewhat Hitler's strategy in what he wanted to see as the final solution. So here we have some posters that were used for propaganda, and the biggest poster there that you can see is actually an American poster for propaganda. So you can see Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito together, kind of colluding and encouraging Americans to fight. But then on the right there, you can see the proud Aryan German with his blonde hair and his Aryan flag, and looking very strong. And in contrast to this Aryan man, you see at the bottom there's a propaganda poster about a Jewish man, and you can see him with his big nose and his shifty eyes and his hat, and he's hiding behind the flags of the United States and Britain, and he's just has bad intentions, obviously. So that gives you a little idea of how the propaganda machine started. And here I have some steps as to how this propaganda evolved. So the first thing that they kind of forced the Jewish people to do was to declare that their business was Jewish. So they encouraged German people to shop in non-Jewish businesses. So it had to be exposed that you were a Jewish business. And this meant, of course, that the people supporting Jewish businesses were mostly other Jewish people. So now you have kind of a situation where they're being unpatriotic because they're only supporting Jewish businesses. So this kind of adds fuel to the fire. The next step was to wear the Star of David. As you can see, these men are wearing the Star of David. They're still living in society. They're still working in the city. They still have their businesses. But it's just another symbol of the fact that they are Jewish and they are not like the rest of the Germans. So on the bottom right there, you have the band that they would have to wear on their arms, much like when you're mourning, or used to be in Europe, when you were mourning, you would have to wear a black band on your arm. This was a yellow band that let everybody know that you were Jewish. So, just imagine today if Certain populations would have to just wear a band to identify themselves as this population, and that they were open to ridicule, and that there really wasn't any stopping anybody from ridiculing them, and that it was the law for them to wear these bands and to identify as such. So this was the situation that they were in. And I also just want to stress that this was something that happened gradually. This wasn't necessarily something that happened from one day to the next, because it really is a question of how could this happen? How could 6 million people be sent to their death and the rest of Europe not notice? But this is exactly what we're going to talk about in this module. So, as you can see, we have Jewish businesses which are functioning in the city. Let's say they're in Berlin or in Amsterdam or wherever. They're functioning in the city, but they have to represent themselves as Jewish. Next step is that you have to identify yourself as Jewish. So you can't walk around the streets without everybody knowing that you're Jewish. The next step is that now all Jewish people are going to be rounded up and sent to work camps. So they're taken out of the city. The people in the city, the citizens, are being told, "Oh, well, this is just their debt to society, but they'll be back. They don't worry about them. They're fine. Don't worry about them." And from these work camps, they're ultimately sent to extermination camps. So they're either sent to concentration camps or extermination camps. So, and I'm sure that you've seen the images of what happens in concentration camps and extermination camps. So at this point, imagine you're living in Berlin, and you live in a nice place, you have a decent business, you're middle class. Your business starts failing a little, because you're Jewish, and then you have to wear a band. And the next thing you know, all of your family and all of your friends are being rounded up, and now you're leaving your home and you're going to work in a work camp. Now you're being taken away from your environment and from any contact with people who were not Jewish. Now you're being sent to a place where there are nothing but Jews. And, this isn't good. So then what they would do is they would put them on trains, stuff them in wagons like, cattle. I wouldn't treat cattle that way, but they were stuffed in wagons for days and just sent off to their final destination, basically. So at this destination, everything would be taken from them: their shoes, their clothes, their jewelry. People would be separated. The old might be immediately exterminated. Women and men and children would have to completely disrobe and be naked in front of each other for no good reason. And this was all kind of something that was allowed and made the Nazis see the Jews as animals and made them objects, and people who didn't need clothes. So, just absolutely terrible time. But I have to say, the people in Europe did not realize that this was going on. They knew that the Nazis were bad, but they did not realize that this was going on until later on. Um, One of the stories that my mom used to tell me is that she lived I'll go to the next slide. She lived in a small town called Mechelen. And if you look at Belgium, it's one of the two towns that's highlighted. So if you look at France and you see that red dot and you go up north, you see two lines there. You see two towns. It's the southernmost town, or the easternmost town, and the SS, the Gestapo, which are if you know anything about Nazi uniforms, they're the ones who are dressed in black. They're kind of the secret police. They came knocking at my mom's house's door, and they almost arrested my grandfather, but then found out that he wasn't the Jewish person they were looking for. So my grandfather lived, but I don't think that his neighbor did. So just to give you an idea of what it was like at the time, you know, just complete fear of what could happen. And also, this map gives you an idea of where the camps were. And as you might notice, they are not so much located in the west, they're more located in the east. So, this is the 1940s. There's not much communication between the east and the west, and most of the cosmopolitan type stuff is happening in the west and not in the east. So when you go off to the east, these are kind of very rural areas, just farmland. So these people were taken out into the farmland and nobody really knew. So I also inlaid some pictures here where you can see the way the bunks were set up. And there are so many movies that are worth watching as far as World War II. And most of the movies I like actually deal with the plight of the Jewish people versus, let's say, the U.S. military accomplishments. So on the top here, you see the bunks and how they just had to sleep together and how thin they were. And on the bottom there, you see the trains that they would just stuff them into and just forget about them for days until they arrived at their destination. And then they were told to strip and they were told to separate from everybody they knew. So families were just torn apart. And then on this map here, you have where the deaths are. So as you can see on this map also,
the internet just died, by the way.
It's mostly in the east. So another question you could ask yourself is, how did Hitler conquer so many countries? And so we're dealing with warfare here, and this is somewhat of it's a new type of warfare because this isn't World War I anymore. We're not riding on horses anymore. And Hitler had a very specific type of warfare, which was called the Blitzkrieg. Blitz means lightning, and Krieg means war. And so the focus of this war was just an all-out attack. So he would use planes, and he would just bomb everything relentlessly. And then he would use more planes to bomb some more specific targets, and then, use whatever military to kind of get whatever was left over. So this is mostly how Hitler took over at that period of time. He didn't respect the non-aggression agreements, and he just went ahead and used these planes and just dropped bombs everywhere, which is why the images that you see of World War II just look absolutely terrible. It just decimated towns all over the place. So here I have some pictures of the different types of vehicles used in World War II. I'll start at the bottom right, which is the planes, which started the Blitzkrieg. And you also had warfare by sea, which, as Americans, you're probably all familiar with the storming of Normandy and the U-boats and all those types of things. And then you have the tanks. The tanks were kind of a new thing. I mean, we were dealing with horses and not much else before. So now we're looking at all this mechanized equipment. And I kind of like this photo at the top because it's an American Jeep, which, my parents used to tell me that the Americans, when the Americans liberated Europe, it was a big deal. And they would kind of parade around the town, and they would give chewing gum to the kids. And my mom had never had chewing gum before, so for her it was a whole new experience. And so the Americans made a big impression even on like little kids. And so here you have what looks like an American Jeep, and inside the Jeep, you have somebody that we would call St. Nicholas. And St. Nicholas is not exactly what you call Saint. You call St. Nick the guy who gives Christmas presents. But St. Nick in countries in Europe is somebody who comes at a different time. And he's there to, if you're good, you get a present. If you're bad, you are beaten. So that's St. Nick, and he makes his rounds, and he also gives oranges. But anyways, so as you can see, the equipment was fairly different. So let's talk about France for a little bit. And the thing I want to mention about France is that after World War I, France decided to have the Maginot Line. And this was a fortified line to stop the Germans from coming into France. So this represents the Maginot Line fairly well, where in some places it's fairly strong, but then in other places it's quite permeable. So although it was an idea at the time, it wasn't a very practical idea, and it did not stop the Germans whatsoever. So France was invaded fairly easily, really. And what France did is it kind of split into two sides. So the people in charge in Paris, once Paris was taken, they fled. They completely fled, and they went to Vichy. And they decided to start a new government there, but then they started collaborating with the Nazis. So the power was moved from Paris to Vichy, but the people who were in charge of Vichy were Nazi, not sure if I should say collaborators, but at least they were friendly to the Nazis. So the Vichy government was headed by Maréchal Pétain and a man named Darnaud, and they were both amenable to what the Nazis had to say. In the north, things were different. Although France was under German occupation, it wasn't necessarily giving into the Germans and buying into their ideas. And another thing I should mention is that the idea that it was just the Nazis is kind of an erroneous idea, because there were actually large numbers of groups around Europe that had the same types of ideas but were not as well organized. So even, let's say in France or Belgium, or Netherlands, anywhere else, there were political parties with the same types of ideas, but without the same leadership or organization as the Nazi Party. So it wasn't just a unique event. This was kind of a fire building that kind of got into a crescendo and ended up in Hitler um, and the Vichy government in France. So, the next module we're going to talk about, the more of the resistance movement and about one of the principal characters in the resistance movement who is a revered person in France, and his name is Charles de Gaulle. So we will talk about Charles de Gaulle. An airport is named after him, and he is one of the most iconic Frenchmen. So I will talk to you next time. Thanks. Bye.